Genji back in the day was a hero that was relatively formidable in the sense that a really, really good Genji player would kind of just destroy your entire team. But unfortunately, Genji has kind of lost his place in Overwatch, and that happened for a lot of reasons, including things that happened back in Overwatch 1, like role queue being one of them, Brig being another thing, the nerfs to him overall, just environment changing, the introduction of new characters and such, kind of removed what made Genji not only a good hero, but a hero in general, because now he no longer really has a place in the game at all, to be honest. And I want to talk about kind of why. Like, for example, this season, a lot of people rate Genji fairly highly. I've seen him be rated as an A tier hero, an S tier hero on one occasion. And then there's people that are a bit more reasonable and say he's about B, which I would agree is relatively near B, probably closer to C in my opinion. I don't think he's very good. And that isn't necessarily because he as a hero is not good, it is more so that his environment is no longer suited for Genji. He can no longer thrive with the way the game is set up. For example, the introduction of 5v5 may seem like one of those things that benefited Genji, where in reality he actually kind of suffered quite heavily from it because he no longer had the ability to work with an off tank in order to secure kills more easier. So he kind of lost his like wingman in those fights where he's no longer capable of doing that anymore because there's only one tank. So he lost a lot of his killing potential in 5v5 because now he needs to take more solo duels, and Genji isn't really a hero that's great at dueling people solo, especially with the current state of the game, where there's heroes like Kiriko who are pretty good, Bap is pretty good, Moira is good, Moira's notoriously difficult to deal with as Genji, Lucio, another hero, notoriously difficult to deal with as Genji, and that's not just to say that it's this season in general that makes him bad. He's been bad for a long time, like ever since the inception of Brig as well, kind of made him unable to 1v1 support heroes anymore. Back in the early days of Overwatch, if you had a really good Genji player, you were going to win most of the time because he was a very solo carry based hero where if you were very, very good at him, you could basically kill everything if you were better than everyone else in the lobby, which I think is completely fine. But he was also one of those heroes where if you were not very good, you did absolutely nothing on him because he was so difficult to play. And I think he's easier to play today than he was back then, but I think that his overall potential has dropped as well. So not only has he gotten easier to play, he's now gotten worse, which I think is fine. I don't think good, like easy to play heroes should be powerful. Like things like Moira, I don't think we should ever have Moira meta. I think Moira meta's horrible for the game. There's no reason that a hero so easy to play should be so strong. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Especially one that is overkitted like Moira is. Like I'm just gonna be like honest with you. Moira's Fade is a relatively dumb ability. I don't like Moira as a character, to be honest. I don't mind her ease to play. I think it's fine. I think there's no issue with her being easy to play at all. My problem is generally the fact that her value is not in line with how easy she is to play. If she's really easy to play, she should get minimal value, but that's not how she works right now. She's really, really easy to play, probably the easiest support in the game, but she's also one of the strongest supports in the game, which I think is a pretty strange way to balance the game, but it is what it is. Anyway, back to talking about Genji. I think Genji's current state doesn't really make any sense in the line of Overwatch because we have heroes like Tracer, who are basically just Genji on steroids. We have Sombra, who's easier to play than Genji and can get significantly more value and easier at that because she has perma invis. We have other options in general, like Sojourn, who's notoriously easy to play but is just extremely powerful, and there's just no reason to ever pick a hero like Genji when you can pick a hero like Sojourn, because a hero like Sojourn is risking less than Genji, but he's also potentially getting more value than if they were to pick Genji in the first place. It just doesn't make any sense to pick Genji if you have the ability to pick Sojourn, and I think that is one of the biggest issues with Genji, is that he is a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none, which I really love about Genji. You can kind of do a bit of everything. You can poke, you can dash on people and go for those quick combo kills and be like hyper aggressive. You can play the more passive playstyle, you can play the map control playstyle that I've showed before and how powerful it is. You can play a dive based Genji, you can play brawl based Genji, you can play a lot of different versions of Genji, and I really love that about his character. But with his ability to do all of that, it means that he's never really the right choice in any scenario, because there are so many characters that do everything so well that he doesn't really have a place. And I think that's fine. I think Genji being able to do a bit of everything is good for his character. However, it would be nice if he was genuinely good at something and not just okay at everything, because currently Genji is a hero who's not very good with dive, because you can just run characters who are better, like Sombra and like Tracer, and like in some scenarios even Reaper, where you just, again, the Genji doesn't really serve a purpose anymore, because Blade is terrible, his shurikens are bad, his cooldowns just don't work in the game anymore, the maps are pretty bad for him, the way the game is now played is pretty bad for him too, because the game is more about staying alive than actually getting value. Like back in Overwatch 1, it was kind of worth going for those riskier plays because the potential was so much higher. But now in Overwatch 2, it's going for those risky plays isn't worth it, because every play is kind of low reward but has relatively high risk attached to it, which makes Genji even worse, because he's a snowball character who snowballs off of value. So if there's less value overall in the game, then there's less snowballing, which makes his character even worse, which is kind of a shame, because that's one of the things that made Genji really interesting to play, was his ability to take an advantage and multiply it and kind of make like a bigger and bigger advantage the better he played over time. I think that was very fun, and I think it was very rewarding too, because it took a lot of different skills in order to make those advantages bigger overall, and it took a level of game sense that wasn't really required from any other hero, because they didn't snowball like Genji did. So the way you would have to play Genji was different to how you had to play every other character, because his win conditions were different. But in the current state of the game, with Blade being so bad, you're not really rewarded for having really good Blade mechanics. With the Shurikens being bigger, you're not really as rewarded for being super precise with him, which I think is actually okay, because the amount of precision it took to be good at Genji was a little bit ludicrous, considering the fact that he could basically kill nothing in the game anyway. So I think the Shuriken changes being bigger is actually good. I would have preferred them to be faster than bigger, but I think bigger Shurikens is still a relatively good thing. However, the actual problem with Genji is that although he has the ability to do a bit of everything, he doesn't do anything really well, like I said earlier, which means that his main purpose of things like taking 1v1s and such doesn't really work anymore. There's no real purpose in order to do that, because you could just go another character instead, which means Genji gets into a lot of these scenarios where if you pick him, you kind of don't do anything, like at least on some other characters. Like if you're on Sojourn, you might be able to like charge a railgun, take an off angle, maybe get like a nice headshot, get a pick, hit like that, or maybe pressure someone off an off angle like that because you have your cooldowns. But Genji can't really do that anymore, because his shurikens are much bigger now, but they're still kind of small-ish relative to like other projectiles. They don't move very fast, they don't do a lot of damage, his cooldowns don't really do a lot of damage. The only really thing that Genji has now is hypermobility, and even then you don't really need hypermobility in this version of the game, because it's not really that important anymore, because generally speaking, if you're running a dive comp, you're not running Genji anyway, so you don't even need the Genji's mobility in order to do anything, because you have other heroes that are, although less mobile than Genji, they offer so many more other things in contrast to Genji that it doesn't really matter, because hypermobility is not exactly a super valuable thing on a DPS if it's literally all they have. Like for example, the mobility on Sojourn is really, really good, even though it's worse than Genji's over mobility, because Sojourn has so much potential that Genji doesn't have. And the reason I make this video is because of characters in the game like McCree and Ashe, who I genuinely don't like as characters. I don't think they're very good in terms of how their stats are made up. I don't like that at super long range they do nothing, and at short range they just immediately fry you and you just die instantly to them because you do too much damage. I think that's pretty cheap. I think they should do a relatively similar amount of damage at all ranges and just lower it. I think that would make way more sense than making them like demons at close range and useless at long range. I also don't like how their abilities are set up. Magnetic Grenade is a notoriously stupid ability. It just doesn't make any sense. Roll giving damage resistance is dumb. Kree having so much health is dumb. Ashe's Coach Gun is just a dumb ability. I think If it had more purposes, then it would be fine, but the problem with it is that you're going to use it one time to jump on top of some high ground, and then you will hold it for the rest of your life because it doesn't do anything else. So that if you do try to solo dive an Ashe, who is typically in the middle of her team anyway, so you're never going to dive her anyway, if you do manage to find her while she's out of position, typically speaking, she's going to have her dynamite and her coach gun anyway, which makes it so the chances of winning the 1v1 are basically zero unless you're diving with a teammate, which is kind of lame because that's not really what Genji was built to do. He was kind of meant to be a solo character. At least that's how I played him, and I was very successful with the solo playstyle back in the day. I know, like, adaptability and such, if I'm unable to adapt, that's my fault. I'm not saying that I should be able to do whatever I want on Genji and be successful. That's obviously stupid. If Genji's not a solo dive character anymore, then he's not a solo dive character anymore, and I have to adapt, obviously. However, that doesn't mean that I have to adapt from that. I like my ability to be more solo because it gave me more carry potential on the character, because I could kind of fill whatever role we needed. Like, for example, if there was a Widow that needed dove, I'm on Genji, I can do that. If there's a Torb turret or a Torb in general that needs to be poked out, I can do that. If my Ryan needs a little bit of help brawling with the tank, you know, I could go Reaper, but like Genji can kind of do that because he's got that super high burst damage at close range, especially on those tank characters with huge head hitboxes where you can chunk a health bar down really fast like that. So he kind of does a bit of everything, but it's still a little bit annoying that he lost his ability to do things on his own, which I think was kind of Genji's identity, was his ability to solo people, and he can't do that anymore, which is really disheartening. And now we get to the point of the video, which is that Genji doesn't really have a purpose in the game anymore, and that's, I think, really bad for the game in general. Like, a lot of characters don't really have a lot of purpose anymore. Like, Symmetra's one of them. She kind of doesn't really do anything anymore. She doesn't serve a purpose because of the immobility creep, as well as just the power creep in general of how characters are designed. And then there's characters like when the introduction of Overwatch 2 came, like things like Kiriko, which further deleted Genji's potential, because Kiriko was kind of just Genji on the support role. If Genji was a good character, she did kind of more damage than him more reliably. She had a smaller hitbox than him. Although she had less mobility, she could literally teleport. She had Suzu heal. Like, there was just no reason, and it made Genji impossible to play, because why would you ever be able to pick Genji against that? And it kind of forced the poke meta, which made Genji not very good anymore, because it's probably the thing he's worst at is poking, but even then he's still okay at poking. But there are other heroes who are better at poking than he is, like Ashe, for example. Why would you pick Genji when you pick Ashe if you're playing a poke meta? He's pointless. Basically, what I'm saying is, I think Genji this season and for the last few years has not only been a bad character, but a character that is borderline completely useless. And this is coming from the perspective of like top 500 Grandmaster level. I'm sure in Gold he does fantastically. I'm sure he's fun to play there. I'm sure you probably hate playing against him if you are like Gold or Plat and you think he's really, really good. And I get that. Like, I'm sorry that Genji is really good in your games. He is not actually very good, especially in Grandmaster, because it's kind of fucking pointless. And a lot of people are going to come with the argument of, like, Grandmaster players are such a low percentage of the game, why balance are in them. I think that's an incredibly stupid argument that I've addressed a lot of times, but I'll address it again for anyone curious. I think the way you balance the game correctly is something called trickle-down balancing, which is the best way to do it and has proven itself in things like Counter-Strike, where, for example, you balance the game around the best players because that's the point of the game. The point of the game is to be competitive for the most part, which means that things that are bad should not be so bad in the higher levels, because that's the best players, and therefore they have the ability to maximize everything's potential. Therefore, for example, if Genji is really good in Grandmaster, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be really good in Gold. It's because those Grandmaster players are able to utilize Genji in such a way that makes him very good. But that might also mean that, for example, like another hero, like Moira has to be good in Grandmaster, and Moira's already really easy to play, so maybe in Gold there'll be too much, but I think that's okay, because that's the point of ranked, is to be the best. And if you are trying to be the best, then if it's fine in Grandmaster, then it's fine in Gold. Because why wouldn't it be? The reason people are Gold is because they're bad, no offense, but if you're Gold, you're probably not very good. And if you're not very good, then your say on balance doesn't really apply, because whether you do well on something is typically not represented by the fact that you are good at it, and typically just because that is a thing that is good in your elo, because people are bad, right? I think that makes more sense. Anyway, goodbye.